Hello everyone, this is Satya Malik and we are going to do the preface to Lyrical Ballads written by William Wordsworth. In the previous video, we did the text from paragraph number 1 to paragraph number 15. In today's video, we are going to attempt the text with simple explanation from paragraph number 16 to paragraph number 34. Please remember, this is part of the BS English program, semester 5, and the name of the course is Foundations of Literary Criticism and Theory. And the course code is ELL 302. Okay, so this is paragraph number 16. In this also, Wordsworth continues to talk about the poet and his writing process, and he believes that the poet communicates emotions which has not directly experienced. So obviously his language has to be mechanical in order to express things that he has not experienced himself, and his language only be a shadow of what is uttered by men in real life under the actual pressure of passions. But this is not how it should be. The poet should try to identify himself with his characters whose feeling he is describing. So obviously the language has to match with the characters. If the characters are taken from the rustic life, the language has to be according to that rustic setting that the poet has chosen. He would be able then to make his language forceful and lively, and at the same time the poet should purify language of the disgusting and painful, for the aim of poetry is to give pleasure. So again, he describes his selection of language, the theory about the selection of language. Even here it says, it is impossible for the poet to produce upon all occasions language as exquisitely fitted for the passion as that which the real passion itself suggests. So it is not possible for the poet to exactly imitate the passions that human beings should be going through, and then select a language that suits that purpose also. It is proper that he should consider himself in the situation of a translator who deems himself justified when he substitute excellences of another kind for those which are unattainable by him. So obviously it is impossible for the poet to go through all the human expressions and emotions, because he cannot go through all those situations himself. But then he can make endeavor, he can justify his language selection, because the language has to be according to the themes and according to the characters that he has chosen. So he even quotes Aristotle. Aristotle, I have been told, had said poetry is the most philosophic of all writing. It is so. Its object is truth, not individual and local, but general and operative, not standing upon external testimony, but carried alive into the heart by passion. Truth, which is its own testimony, which gives strength and divinity to the tribunal to which it appeals and receives them from the same tribunal. Poetry is the image of man in nature. So he believes that the poetry should be as natural as possible, because the poet gives you a kind of a truth which is very different from the truth given to you by a biographer or a historian. So the same argument has been taken from Aristotle, because in Aristotle's Poetics, he differentiates between the art of a poet and the art of a biographer and a historian and even a philosopher. In Poetics, Aristotle said that the philosopher gives you an abstract idea of reality. The historians give you an exact idea of reality without changing anything. He cannot tell you what could have happened and what might have happened, but he only tells you what happened in the past. Same is with the biographer. The biographer again cannot change anything on his own. But the poet has this ability to actually give you an idea of what could have happened. That is the ideal. That is something which is far beyond the truth. So the kind of truth that the biographer and the historian deal with, they are very factual and very rigid. But as far as the poet is concerned, he can actually give you the notion of dignity of his art, because he can transcend both the biographer and the historian. So the poet writes under one restriction only, namely that of the necessity of giving immediate pleasure to human beings possessed of that information which may be expected of him, not as a lawyer, a physician, a mariner, an astronomer, or a natural philosopher, but as a man. So he basically exalts the poet's status above all these other professions mentioned here, that he believes that he is the only person who talks to you as a man. The rest of these all professions, they talk to you as different things. The lawyer would only talk about the law. The physicians would only talk about the law, its physics. The astronomer would only talk about stars and nothing else. But a poet would talk to you about human nature, human passions, human feelings, unrestricted. And they would not be local, but they will be more universal. So that is why the poet is much more to be applauded than all the rest of these art. In this paragraph also, he continues. 16 and 17 almost have the same theme. If you look at the highlighted portion here, what then does the poet? So what is the job of the poet? He considers man and objects that surrounds him as acting and reacting upon each other so as to produce an infinite complexity of pain and pleasure. So he realizes that he can't just talk about pleasure and pleasure and pleasure, because pain is part of the human existence also. So he needs to look at the complexity of both of these emotions. He considers man in his own nature and his ordinary life as contemplating this with a certain quantity of immediate knowledge, with certain convictions, institutions, deductions, which by habit become of the nature of the intuitions. He considers him as looking upon this complex scene of ideas and sensations, finding everywhere objects that immediately excite in him sympathies, which from the necessities of this nature are accompanied by an overbalance of enjoyment. So his job is to look around him, look at people, look at their pain, look at their pleasure, and learn from it, contemplate on it, become intuitive about it, deduce whatever comes out of it. So he gives meaning to human experience. Whatever the people are going through, the poet actually puts it down in black and white. So a lot of people, when they are going through an experience, they are unable to write about it, but the poets, they have the gift to actually write about it. Next is paragraph number 18. Here he talks about the beauty of poetry, or maybe you can say how poetry is better than the other arts. He says that the poetic pleasure is not mere ideal amusement, so it's not just for your pleasure. Poetry is the most philosophical of all writings. The object of poetry is general and operative truth. It is the image of man and nature. The only restriction under which the poet works is the necessity of giving pleasure. So that is his foremost job, to give you pleasure, but at the same time, if he can teaches you something, that is even a plus, because Philip Sidney said that the object of poetry is delight and teach. Aristotle also said that the poet is the only one who gives you pleasure, but at the same time he teaches you something. So even Wordsworth, he follows the same creed, and he believes that, you know, his job is actually to give you pleasure and teach you at the same time, but in a very pleasurable way, not in a didactic ceremonial way, but in a pleasurable way. So moving to the next paragraph, in this paragraph he basically compares the man of science with poet, because the Wordsworth time was a time of science and scientific revelations. So everybody thought that science was more important than poetry, because poetry is worthless and science gives you something. So he believes that both the scientist and the poet, they are working for knowledge, and that knowledge leads to pleasure. So the knowledge gained by both the poet and the man of science is pleasure. The difference is that while the knowledge of the poet is universal and cleaves to us as a necessary part of our existence, that of the man of science is personal and individual acquisition. So he believes that the poet still is much more universal in his outlook, in his reach. He can relate to everybody, no matter where that person is living, but the man of science is quite confined as far as his work scope is concerned. So although the work of science might be more practical, but still it's a personal work and an individual acquisition, which is devoid of any emotions. A man of science would not believe in emotions. He would believe in intellect, facts and figures and proof of things in front of him. But whereas the poet also believes in things that he cannot see and he cannot understand. For example, the feelings and emotions, they cannot be gauged by any instrument. So the poet believes in abstract, whereas a man of science believes in only the concrete. So that is one of the major distinction between the two. Okay, so this is paragraph 19. Again, he comes back to the topic of language of poetry, and he talks about the suitability of language selection. So he says, what I have thus far said applies to poetry in general, but especially to those parts of composition where the poet speaks through the mouth of the characters. So he believes whenever a poet has to say something that the characters would say in the same situation, it actually puts a lot of pressure on the poet to produce the kind of language that that person would produce in that situation. So there are a few persons of good sense who would not allow that the dramatic part of composition are defective and in proportion as they deviate from the real language of nature and are colored by a diction of poet's own. So what the poets do is they put their own words in the mouth of the characters, which is wrong. Obviously, the language should suit the character. If the characters have been taken from the lower strata, then the language should suit them. It's not that a very mundane sort of a character would open his mouth and a philosophy would come out of it. So that should not happen. So the poet, or belonging simply to the poet in general, to a body of men who from circumstance of their composition being in meter expected to will employ a particular language. So obviously the language has to be a little refined but not totally artificial. So the theme and the character should suit the language that the poet selects. So at the end, in this this is his paragraph number 20. So in this paragraph, he believes that the main function of the poet is he's chiefly distinguished from other men by a greater promptness to think and feel without immediate external excitement, a great power in expressing such thoughts and feelings as are produced in him in that manner. But these passions and thoughts and feelings are the general passions and thoughts and feelings of men. So he has to be able to relate to common people and understand their emotions, express them as they happen. So this also is deferred, and this objective of poetry gets a little injured when you put a lot of wordiness in it. So when you put a lot of artificial language in it, then that purpose is destroyed. So the emotions should be copied as they happen, the intensity should be the same, the language should be selected according to the intensity of the emotion or the experience of that person. So it should not be either below or above it. So he is basically pleading for a language selection that suits the purpose and suits the theme and also suits the character. So we move to paragraph number 21, and this is where Wordsworth is answering the question that why he chose to write in verse. I mean, he could have chose to write in prose, because he himself has said that there is no difference between prose and verse. So why just verse then? So he says that he chose to write in verse because there is no reason why he should not do so when meter can add charm to this description. So he is actually admitting the fact that addition of meter actually adds more pleasure to poetry because of the sing-song effect and because of the rhyming that it adds to poetry. But the presence of meter does not employ poetic diction. But he says that writing in meter does not mean that I should select superficial language or difficult language to accompany it. By writing in meter means that I would be adhering to some rules of rhyme and rhythm, but it does not force me to choose words which are very superficial and very decorated. So writing in meter does not automatically force me to use language which is very artificial. Meter has a restraining effect on the flow of emotion and passion. It softens the painful and the pathetic because it has a distancing effect. So he believes that meter regulates our emotion, something which is very painful to write. When we write in meter, we can easily talk about it. And it provides the element of contrast and perception also, which always gives pleasure. So one of the biggest reason for pleasure in poetry is that it is written in meter. And when something is written in meter, it is easily palpable, it is easily digestible, because a lot can be said in fewer lines. But if you have to write it in prose, a more description has to add to it. So that is one of the advantages that he admits is given to poetry through meter. Then we move to this famous definition given by him about poetry. I've said that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. It takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till by a series of reactions the tranquility gradually disappears, and emotion kinder to that which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced and does itself actually exist in the mind. In this mood, successful composition generally begins, and in a mood similar to this, it is carried on. But the emotion of whatever kind and in whatever degree from various causes is qualified by various pleasure, so that in describing any passion whatsoever, which is voluntarily described, the mind will upon the whole be in the state of enjoyment. So this paragraph is basically a description of his poetic process. So how he creates. This is the process of creation of Wordsworth. So he believes that whatever came to him, it was recollected, and the emotion is recollected till the tranquility disappears, and in emotions like that similar emotion which was before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced. And after contemplation and after filtering out the negative aspects of it, the poet starts writing about it. In the describing of any passion, the mind is in state of enjoyment throughout. So I gave you the process of creation of Wordsworth. There are 4 stages here. The first is observation. The second is recollection. The third one is filtering or contemplation. And the last one is creation or composition. So this is how his mind works. Please remember that every poet writes in a different. So here Wordsworth's explanation continues of what kind of language he is convinced that he should be writing, especially this highlighted portion. Such faulty expressions were I convinced they are faulty at present and that they must necessarily continue to be so, I will willingly take all reasonable pains to correct. But it is dangerous to make these alterations on the simple authority of a few individuals or even of certain classes of men, for where the understanding of an author is not convinced or his feeling altered, this cannot be done without great injury to himself. So this is basically a warning against false criticism. Wordsworth believes that there is going to be a huge criticism on his poems, and this is going to come from the very notable critics of his time, like Samuel Johnson and the people like him. They would utterly reject these new poems written according to them on unworthy subjects and having language which is too arbitrary, too commonplace, and the ideas which are also very commonplace. So he feels that they are going to be rejected. So he comes to the faults which critics might find in his poems. He may be charged with dealing with unworthy subjects, or he may be accused of making an arbitrary connection of ideas and feelings which are not there. And he might be charged with using words and phrases which are very commonplace. But Wordsworth says that I'm not going to change them. He is not going to make any alteration to please some critics. So he's not going to do it to make some critics happy, because he himself did not feel that he had been arbitrary. So he feels that his aim was worthy and his language was suitable. He would not be modifying his language, as that would mean going contrary to his feeling. And for him, a poet is his own feeling as his support and stay. So if he cannot be fair to his own feelings and his own emotions, then he is not worthy to be called a poet. So he's quite resolute, he's quite decisive that he's not going to alter anything. Number one, once he starts doing that, there is not going to be any end to it, because everybody would have some criticism about some word that he has used. And the other thing is that this would show a lack of self-confidence also. This would show that he is not very confident about his poetry as well. So he is not going to make any changes as far as his language or themes or selection of character is concerned, because that would show that he was not very confident to start with. And then he talks about that poetry is not just about words. So he's pleading the critics that come out of this notion of just looking at the language, because poetry is much more than language, much more than meter, and it is basically about sense. It's about a worthy cause. And in the next paragraph, this is paragraph number 26, he basically quotes two passages. One is by Dr. Johnson and the other one is from a famous ballad. So he believes that what actually matters in poetry is the feeling and not the language. So he compares these two stanzas. You can see it here. This stanza is written by Dr. Johnson. I put my hat upon my head and walked into the Strand, and there I met another man whose hat was in his hand. As far as language is concerned, as far as rhyme and rhythm is concerned, perfect. So immediately under these lines, I will place one of the most justly admired stanzas of the Babes in the Wood. That was one of the ballads. These pretty babes, with hand in hand, went wandering up and down, but never more they saw a man approaching from the town. So he, according to Wordsworth, the latter, this one, is poetry, because it embodies nobler feelings. The former, that is this one, embodies no deep feeling at all. So that is the difference between the two stanzas. Even though there is a little difference in words and even in the order of words, Wordsworth requests the readers to judge poems on the basis of feelings and not by words, especially the words of the critics. So he concludes here, in both these stanzas, the order of the words in no respect differ from the most unimpassioned conversation. There are words in both, for example, the Strand and the town, connected with none but more familiar ideas. Yet, the one stanza we admit as admirable, the other one as a fair example of the superlatively contemptible. So that was very brave of Wordsworth, actually going against Dr. Johnson, because Dr. Johnson was one of the most staunch critic of his time. So criticizing Dr. Johnson was a very brave thing to do indeed by Wordsworth. But he is addressing a lot of people like Dr. Johnson. So please look beyond the words, look beyond meter, look at the feelings that are being expressed. So he just, after this one, this is paragraph number 31 to 34, it's more like a conclusion. So I have one request to make to my reader, which is that in judging these poems, he would decide by his own feelings, genuinely, and not by the reflection of what will probably the judgment of others. So he is just requesting the reader that just have your own judgment about my poems and do not rely on the reviews or the criticisms done by other people. I myself do not object to this style of composition or this or that expression, but to such and such class of people it will appear mean or ridiculous. So don't criticize these poems for just the means of criticism, for just the purpose of criticism, but read them. If you enjoy yourself, it means that I have done my job nicely. If not, you should be clear about it, but do not base your argument or your criticism on the judgment made by others. So he is asking the readers to don't make hasty or rash decision. And he also is asking them that they should reconsider the works of a poet if it does not impress one at the first reading, especially if you have read different kind of poetry earlier. Sometimes a new work of art does not impress you immediately. But in order to create an accurate taste in poetry, some time has to be spent. Some time has to be given to people to digest and get used to a certain kind of poetry. So Wordsworth also takes upon himself this duty of the creation of taste, the cultivation of taste, as you can say, that an accurate taste in poetry is an acquired talent, something that is learned with the passage of time, required only by continuous and strenuous acquaintance with the best work of art. So people are not going to come across good taste on its own, but you always acquire good taste by reading good things, classy things, best work of art. And he also realizes that the readership of his time, they are so corrupted by the poetry written in their time that it is going to take them some time to actually realize the beauty of these new poems that he has written. So he says he's basically pleading the writer to take time. The reader has been used to another type of poetry, and for getting a new type of pleasure, the reader should peruse these poems with an open mind. So in order to accept his poetry or enjoy his poetry, the reader has to get rid of the older way of writing poems and then read his poems with an open mind. And even towards the end, he says, for what has been said and from perusal of the poems, the reader will be able to clearly perceive the object which I have proposed to myself. He will determine how far I have attained this object, and what is much more important question, whether it is worth attaining. And upon the decision of these two questions will rest my claim to the approbation of the public. So he is just leaving the judgment to the public, and it is not relying on the judgment of the critics of his time. So he believes that it would be suited to the interest of mankind permanently and importantly if these poems are read with an open mind, because poetry would evolve out of it. The poetry has to improve out of the neoclassical literature. And you can say the preface ends with a fresh plea to the reader to read his poems with an open mind and to judge for themselves if what the poet has set out to achieve has been achieved or not, or whether it was a worthy task or not. So this is where the preface ends with a request to the reader to judge the poems on their own, genuinely, according to their likes and dislikes. Because this is a turning point as far as poetry is concerned in England, and he realizes that if his experiment is rejected, it should be rejected by the readership and not just by the critics. So you can say that he's putting himself on the mercy of the readers, and he's also requesting them to read these poems with a very open mind, because they are going to be different. They have different themes, they have different characters, and most importantly, the language is way, way simpler than the readership has been used to read in the poems of the neoclassical poets. So with this, we come to the end of the preface. If you have any questions, please do ask in the comments box. Also like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe the channel. Thank you.